Good morning. Let's get started with our second speaker this morning. I'm Linda Longton. I'm Senior Vice President of Editorial and Research for Randall Riley, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our second speaker. As Administrator of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, Anne Ferro is committed to protecting the traveling public by eliminating severe crashes and fatalities involving large trucks and buses. Ms. Ferro serves as the head of an agency that carries out its safety mission through a strategic mix of programs, rules, and enforcement tools based on three principles: to raise the bar for motor carrier safety, to require high safety standards to operate, and to remove unsafe carriers and drivers from our roads. In her first 2 years, Administrator Ferro has led FMCSA's actions to fulfill its safety-focused mission, including rules to ban texting and handheld cell phone use for truck and bus drivers, an hours of service rule for trucking to reduce the risk of fatigue-related crashes, a strengthened enforcement program known as Compliance, Safety, and Accountability, and targeted enforcement activities and consumer outreach to prevent unsafe passenger carriers from operating on our roads. Prior to her appointment to the FMCSA, Ms. Ferro led the Maryland Motor Truck Association as its president and CEO, and served as the State of Maryland's Motor Vehicle Administrator. It's my great pleasure to welcome Anne Ferro.
Good morning, everybody. I see we lost a few folks. You just had a podium pro here in Ari Fleischer, and now we move on to the bureaucrat talking about regulatory. I mean, why is it not as entertaining as Ari Fleischer? I don't get it. I don't get it. Do we not have the inside scoop? Not as well as he does, nor as well as he tells a story. But it is just a pleasure to join those of you who are here, who came back in, to talk a little bit about where the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration is headed from a regulatory context, from a programmatic context, and also to get into some questions in terms of things that are on your mind. It's tough to share anything new with all of you, particularly in the context of a conference sponsored by CCJ, or I should say coordinated and organized by CCJ, because they do a great job staying on top of the news, staying on top of what the FMCSA is doing when it comes to improving the safety environment overall, or comes to actually responding to issues and concerns that have been brought forward, or when it comes to actually taking very tough action on carriers, those few that truly defy our orders to shut down when we do take that kind of an action. And that really gets at the core of what the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration is all about. We are all about safety. I'm in a room full of folks who make a career out of ensuring safety in your operations is fundamental to everything you do. But as a federal agency, we were created a dozen years ago by Congress specifically with the purpose of reducing crashes that involve trucks and buses, saving lives that way, but doing it in the context of holding safety as our highest priority above all in our oversight and regulatory work with the commercial vehicle industry. That's how Congress set our structure, and at the same time, Congress set forth a number of expectations and mandates, programs that they felt we needed to put forward in order to ensure safety in the operation of commercial vehicles. But we also take an awful lot of information both from petitions, from recommendations, and fundamentally from our own analysis and research in deriving programs that, in our perspective, up the bar on safety. From the time I came on board with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, I clarified for all of us that we are working within a framework of three core principles. And the first one, and one that rises supreme across the board, is raising the bar, raising the safety bar to operate in the commercial vehicle industry. There's no easier place to look than to see how easy it is to get a DOT number, regardless of the level of knowledge you have in commercial vehicle operations, to see that in many cases, while this is an incredibly robust industry when it comes to small business operations, there are elements about coming into the process that make it too easy to reincarnate, too easy to be a chameleon. and actually, frankly, undercut the carriers that are reputable, that are doing a good work, and that have been working very hard for many years to do the right thing for their customers, for their communities, and for their employees. So with that, raising the bar to safety is one of our founding and foundational principles, ensuring that those who are operating in the industry are maintaining high standards to stay there. No better example than CSA, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. And then making sure that as a federal agency and with our law enforcement partners across the country, we're getting you the right tools to make sure unsafe operators aren't behind the wheel. We're giving our law enforcement partners across the country the right tools to make sure they're pulling over the carriers, or I should say pulling off the road the carriers that shouldn't be operating. And we're making sure that anyone who's in that condition has the right, is taking the right steps to remedy the problem, or actually not getting back into the business. So it's raising the bar, maintaining high standards, and getting the bad actors off the road. And that third component matters whether it's a driver, whether it's a vehicle, whether it's a company, or frankly, whether it's an entity that credentials any one of these, any one of the three, like medical examiners. So over the course of the past decade, particularly in the past 5 to 6 years, there has been a remarkable improvement in overall commercial vehicle safety. Within the economic downturn, but more importantly throughout the period of higher VMT, the overall crash rate involving a truck or a bus has come down 30% between 2005 and 2010. And 2011 looks like we're going to be holding our own there as well. So the trend has absolutely been in the right direction, and that's as a result of many of the actions that you all have taken. It's as a result, in many ways, of the influence that happens when a law enforcement officer pulls a carrier over or talks to a driver, or when one of our own investigators goes into a company and talks about the safety management cycle and a whole safety management system. So in that context, in my introduction, I identified that we really do use rules, tools, and programs and research to get at the right mix of strategies to make sure that you're operating in an environment that you can count on is addressing those that may be trending in the wrong direction for safety. So I'm going to touch on CSA, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the rules that we have either just made final or are underway so that you have a clear sense of where we're headed. From the perspective of compliance, safety, accountability, now this is a program that has been developed over 3 administrators, which really started under Annette Sandberg, and it was started in the right way. It was started with a broad national discussion that industry was invited to, law enforcement was invited to, a whole effort to say, how is our current system of identifying carriers that are presenting a risk, how is that system through SafeStat working? Is there a better way to do it? And it was really through the start of that process that the team collectively, and everybody who worked on CSA, came to the point of using current performance data through roadside inspections, grouped and analyzed into 7 core basics to actually improve and overall strengthen the enforcement platform that we work from. That's how CSA came about over really the course of 8 years of discussion, of analysis, and of going back to something we have been doing for many, many years, which is the roadside inspection, and ensuring that we were using all the data points in that inspection, not just out-of-service violations. It's through using all those data points on violations or on clean inspections that you've been seeing for years, and making each of those data points, each of those inspections count, that we're truly giving you better visibility into the operation of your own equipment, and us better visibility and a better mechanism and better data by which to really prioritize our work. Because as a federal agency, and working very closely, in fact, our primary force multiplier are our state law enforcement partners across the country. As a federal agency, we need to be sure that we're using the tax dollars we have in a way that actually is getting at carriers that could be presenting a risk, or helping those carriers that have violation or compliance issues that can be easily addressed so they don't trend in that direction. So through the performance data in CSA, we created the safety measurement system. In CSA, it's important to know, it's really a 3-part program and a 3-part rollout. It's the SMS, which all of you use today. You see it on your own CSA screen. I hope you've been looking at it pretty regularly, particularly during this preview period. It's that data under the SMS and the safety measurement system itself that replaced SafeStat for us and is the tool we use to prioritize who we go to look at for a compliance review or a focused review, or to whom we send a warning letter. And it's that data that we provide for our state law enforcement officers to use in determining who should be pulled over for an inspection, along with some of their regular random work. So it's a real prioritizing tool. It is not a safety rating. It is our use. It is data that we use to ensure that we're doing the right thing. And it's data that you use to give better visibility into your programs and, again, into your operation. The second part of CSA is a process change. And the process change is what all of us, frankly, have been undergoing as we look at and use the SMS data and the 7 basics to actually give us a better understanding not just of what's happening, what are the violations, what's going on with the equipment or the driver at the roadside, but why is it happening? Using that data to dig deeper into your company's operation to say, is it something in our dispatch process? Is it something, if there are any shippers in this room, are there unreasonable components about shipping contracts and shipping demands that make it impossible to meet certain expectations without pressing the system too hard or having violations? So it's really looking at the full why of what's going on, not just the what, and using the performance data to do that. That's been a process change for all of us. And frankly, I'm pleased to be joined here by Teresa Williams-Jones, who's our division administrator here in Alabama. Teresa, just give a wave in the back for anyone who doesn't already know Teresa. She's a phenomenal division administrator here. And with her team, they, in fact, have been going through a big process change and learning how to share the data in the CSA and the SMS system and talk through it with carriers when they're doing compliance reviews or focus reviews, or talking on the phone because of a carrier or driver that calls with a question. So that's the process change piece. The third piece of CSA is a rule. Hard for us to do anything without a rule somewhere in the mix. And that rule is what I call our safety fitness determination rule. Today, to have a safety rating requires an on-site compliance review, a full compliance review. That's by law. Under the proposed SFD, safety fitness determination rule, which again is a primary, the third component of CSA, we would attach the safety rating to the CSA, the SMS data. In other words, the SMS data would be what drives the safety rating for a company. The difference in a proposed rule like that is that, as you know, the SMS data that we use today for prioritizing is a relative system. You're always being measured against a peer group or a grouping based on miles, based on power units, based on inspections. And it's relative. As they get better, you need to get better. So it's a relative measure. Under a proposed rule, we would set thresholds so that there's a standard fixed point that you need to achieve in order to stay within the compliance range. So that safety fitness determination rule is something we've been hard at work on, and we expect to have that on the street as a proposal by the end of this calendar year or early in 2013. So we're very hopeful that everybody will look closely at it. In the meantime, we continue to be, I made a very strong commitment when we rolled out CSA in late 2010, a very strong commitment to continue this as a dynamic system. It has been too important of an enforcement tool and provided a much clearer focus and a better analysis for us of carriers we need to be working with to not continue to advance improvements in that measure and in that system. So the way we go about looking at improvements is really through feedback from those of you who are using it, from our state law enforcement partners, from our own employees, and from our own analysis to see how can we continue to improve that SMS measure and tool to sharpen our focus on the carriers we need to be looking at. Again, it's an allocation of resources and to minimize spending time with carriers who don't show any trends in the too high direction in their basics. So to that point, we took in a lot of input and rolled it into an analysis and what you see today as a preview. So if you go to your own CSA website and your SMS data, you see you can open the screen to see your measures under the current 7 basics and your measures under the preview of a standalone hazmat basic, where all of the load securement violations are moved into the vehicle maintenance basic. And there's some other changes in there in terms of just ensuring the integrity of the data itself. That preview is underway today because we need, for the very specific reason that we want your input. The comments that led to us building those changes were from industry, and in some cases the result has some in industry very concerned, and we need to know what those concerns are so that we can address them. One simple example is if you look at your CSA page, and if you're looking at a screen, it's up on the right-hand side, there's summary data for your out-of-service violations and sort of a lumped number, summary numbers on crashes. tow away, as well as a number that's summarized as injuries and fatalities. Because there are over 500,000 carriers we regulate, and about 490,000 of them have no injury or no fatal crashes, I should say, in the past 2 years. There were a number of carriers that said, could you break that number out so that it shows that we have 0 fatalities and it just shows injury crashes? Because our shippers are wondering if we actually have fatalities in the mix. So we did that. But the carriers that do have some fatalities are very concerned because all of a sudden their fatalities are isolated from their injury numbers. But again, there are about 490,000 carriers that don't have any fatalities who are probably somewhat relieved, certainly those who asked us to consider that change. So again, we need your kind of input because it really will drive what those changes look like. Now, a few numbers with CSA, and then I'll get onto some of the regs. We do oversee about 500,000. We have what we term 500,000 active carriers in our system. And by active, it means it's a carrier that's shown a pulse in the past 24 to 36 months. MCS 150 update, an inspection, an insurance update, some sort of a activity that we've either visually seen on the roadside, on a compliance review, or through a data interaction, a system interaction. So those 500,000 carriers, and I'm just talking about freight at this point. We've got another 12,000 that are passenger carriers. We have sufficient data in CSA, sufficient inspection data, to analyze 200,000 companies out of the 500,000. 92% of all crashes are attributed to or are accounted for by those 200,000 carriers. So that other sort of the remaining 300,000 carriers represent about 8% of the crashes, which means by looking at the 200,000, knowing that our mission is to reduce crashes involving trucks or buses, we're looking at the right population. We're not saying they are caused by it, but 92% of the crashes are attributed to those 200 carriers for whom we have sufficient data that they are analyzed in those basics. Those 200,000 carriers represent 80% of the power units being operated across the country. So if we bore down a little bit deeper, in those 500,000 active carriers, about 50,000 have a basic that's above, one or more basics above a threshold. Those 50,000 carriers represent about 30% of the power units, a little less actually, and almost 45% of all of the injury and fatal crashes. So again, it's, these are very kind of gross measures, but they help us reinforce as we dive deeper into the data that we're looking at the right population. Now, as we dive deeper, it's just a fact that crash history, preventable and non-preventable, crash history is directly correlated to as a predictor of future crashes. It just is what the analysis says, whether it's the federal government doing the analysis or ATRI doing the analysis or a university doing the analysis. Crash history is one of the strongest predictors, along with unsafe driving, by the way, of a future crash. And so we do have this large database of crash history. And one of the very, I think, important discussions that we've had, somewhat controversial, always very important, is the question about crash accountability. And how are we as a federal agency under CSA going to address crash accountability when it comes to including the crash indicator as one of the 7 basics? We have pursued, this is an old discussion, it predates CSA, I know, and it predates just the past few years, because we've had the crash data available on our website under SafeStat and for many years going. But it's more relevant today because it is so clear in your own crash indicator that's not viewable to the public. We are continuing our analysis of the crash accountability question. We call it crash weighting, because whether we've met with industry to talk about it or the safety community or our law enforcement partners, the question comes down to whether if there is a crash in my history as a carrier, are you going to weight it the same if it was a non-preventable crash versus a preventable crash? So we refer to that as crash weighting. The way we had anticipated looking at that question and trying to address that question was going to be through police accident reports. It may still be through police accident reports. But police accident reports vary from state to state. There are key elements that need to be in each report, but the report itself varies. Timeliness is much better across the country for crash reporting. Almost all states now report within 90 days. But the content of that report may change if it's the initial police accident report or the final police accident report that may actually be finalized months after that crash, after the police have done their own investigation. So the challenge for us in using that as a data source is, do we know we've got the final police accident report? When we look at that police accident report, is it a clear indicator? Does it give us enough information to determine preventability or non-preventability, other than in the most obvious of cases? And in that case, if that's the case, and we are to determine non-preventability and sort of withdraw all the non-preventable crashes from the over 100,000 that occur each year, what does it do? Does it skew the database, or does it actually prove out our hypothesis that if we're only looking at preventable crashes, we're looking at the highest risk carriers? So those are the elements of the analysis that's underway today. An extra component of that analysis is, how do we make this a fair system? If an entity, an individual company, files for us to look at a police accident or a crash and determine preventability, how do we make sure the other party that may have been injured by that crash, which could be another trucking company, how do we make sure that other party has an opportunity to submit a comment as well? And once we open that process up, how do we manage the thing? Do we just get overwhelmed by the overall process? And how much does that overall process cost the taxpayer? And if it does actually improve the overall safety of our work and improve our focus, then it might very well be the right investment to make. So again, we're continuing with that analysis. We're very serious about completing that analysis, and I expect we'll have it done by the end of this year, and we'll share with everybody what those results are, probably through a Federal Register notice. So stay tuned on crash weighting, because it's a very important part of CSA. And please stay tuned in the preview and take a look at it. We are going to actually extend the comment period on this preview. We were going to wrap it up at the end of May, but we're going to extend it. We'll be announcing that tomorrow. See, CCJ heard it first. We haven't announced it yet. Might not even be announcing it till Thursday, but there you go. But I think it's just very important for carriers to know how we're approaching that. So one other piece about CSA, and then let me move on. One of the other changes in this preview was to take, as you heard me say earlier, all the load securement violations that were in the cargo basic and move them into the vehicle maintenance basic. In doing that, there was has been some concern expressed in the comments we've received that we were diluting the seriousness of load securement violations on mostly on open bed vehicles, because the ones that really rose to the surface were the open bed because they're easier to see on the flatbed. But what our analysis actually identifies is to the contrary. By putting those load securement violations in the vehicle maintenance basic, the value of that basic in actually identifying the companies with the highest crash risk went up 40%. So it really is, it's all about using our data to give us the clearest picture of who we should be looking at. And so that's the kind of analysis we do routinely. The hazmat basic is a little bit different than the others because it's not referring to crash risk. The analysis is referring to the risk of future violations in hazardous materials communication and notification, placarding, bills of lading, making sure the right papers are there so that when first responders do arrive on a scene, they know what to do right away. It's the concept of really minimizing the severity of the outcome of a crash by ensuring folks are properly informed by virtue of the placarding and the paperwork. So real quickly, let me jump through some of the other programs we're working on or the rules we're working on, and then we can open it up for questions. Electronic onboard recorders. This has been a rule that in recent months has met with more controversy than the discussion had seen in years past. It is a proposal that we're pressing forward with, and the proposal is to require electronic onboard recorders across the full fleet of motor carriers, bus and truck operators that maintain records of duty status. So that's virtually everybody. The prior rule, we've done this in a couple pieces. We had a remedial rule that was final in 2010 that said if you've got a violation history and hours of service of 10% or more, we're going to require you to install EOBRs on all of your equipment. That's the rule. While that rule was going final, we went out with a proposal for a full EOBR mandate. It's that remedial rule that was struck down by the court last September, following on a finding by the court in a suit filed by OIDA that as an agency we'd failed to address the issue of harassment and the potential use of an EOBR to harass drivers. It was a very solid finding because that provision actually appears in federal law. Congress had said if you're going to do an EOBR mandate, you have to minimize the risk that the device is used to harass drivers. We failed to do that in that remedial rule. That rule happened to include all of our technical requirements and technical specifications for the device. So we have spent, so those technical specs are gone. The rule that stands today is the AOBRD rule that's been longstanding. Over the past year, we've worked very closely with EOBR manufacturers, with companies that use and those that don't use EOBRs, with drivers, with the safety community, and our own enforcement partners to develop technical specifications. We've also worked through listening sessions to hear what the concerns are that some drivers have about the use, or experienced drivers have, about the use of EOBRs or some sort of a fleet management device that harassed them, that prevented them perhaps from getting proper rest, that resulted in them being less safe or less focused when they were on the road. And then the third component is to make sure that we've addressed the supporting documents requirements for hours of service once an EOBR mandate is in effect and paper logs go away. So those are the three components that we're working on now that we'll put forward in what's called a supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking. It's called an SNPRM. It's going to build on the proposed rule that's already on the street, that's a rule that proposes EOBRs across the fleet, across the nation, and actually addresses those three components. So that SNPRM will also be something that you'll see very late this year or early in the first quarter of 2013. It'll be a proposal. It will be something we need your feedback on. And it's our approach to ensuring that what we see as a very important hours of service compliance device is applied across the board, and we get away from paper logbooks. So from the perspective of, since I'm talking about logbooks, I'll jump real quickly to hours of service. July 2013 is the date to keep in mind on hours of service. That's what you want to, that's when the new rule takes effect. That's what we're all building towards, and training our enforcement. We'll be training enforcement over the course of the summer, more sophisticated training than our initial rollout. And July 2013 is when that rule takes, actually fully kicks in. So lastly, a couple of the driver initiatives. Distracted driving. We are still seeing, now you know we have in place mandates that prohibit the use of a texting, prohibit texting when you're operating a commercial vehicle, and prohibit handheld use while operating a commercial vehicle. Over the course of these two pieces being in place, law enforcement has cited over 1,300 drivers and about 1,000 companies for violating that provision. It's pretty remarkable because I know so many of you have had policies in place for a long time to minimize the risk that your drivers would be distracted. But there is, we all saw it, Teresa and I just saw it driving in, a box truck driver, busy talking on his phone and texting while he was coming around a corner. It's incredible that people are still that stupid, but they're out there, and everything you can do to minimize that they are that stupid, thank you, because I know many of you already do that. You do it with your own employees. You do it through your customers, and you do it with your family members and friends. So let's all keep at it and save the stupid from themselves so they don't put everybody else at risk. You know, that 4 seconds looking at a text message at 55 miles an hour is the length of a football field. Now, if you're flying a plane with all sorts of electronic controls, that 4 seconds looking away from the screen and the clouds isn't going to make that much of a difference. But boy, when you're barreling down the road in a commercial motor vehicle or personal vehicle, those 4 seconds, a lot can happen. We also just finalized a National Registry for Medical Examiners, which is the second step in closing the gaps, closing the loopholes for fraud in the driver qualification piece and the medical certification requirement. The first requirement was tying the med cert actually to the CDL, and most states are deploying that as we speak, ensuring that the med cert expiration date actually does impact the CDL status if the driver does not get a current med cert into their DMV. The registry requires medical examiners to know the driver qualification requirements to operate a commercial vehicle, which are tough qualifications, and ensuring that those who are providing medical examiners know them, are tested in them, and are actually listed in our registry. The registry will open for examiners, medical examiners, to enroll by the end of this summer. It's already up. It's available to peruse and look at. The curriculum elements are there. Guidebooks are there. And again, any medical examiners that you may be using, I encourage you to encourage them to jump into the registry to get moving into that system. The actual mandate doesn't take effect until May of 2014. So any driver who has a medical certification or a medical exam done after May of 2013, after May of 2014, has to have it done by a physician that's in that registry. Any exam done before then falls under the current rules, which are none. But after that, the exam they get has to be from someone who has already proven themselves knowledgeable in the FMCSRs. So with that, let me wrap it up to just say that we are pressing ahead with our proposal for a drug and alcohol clearinghouse. That's a very important tool for all of you. You have really been running blind for too many years, and we owe it to you to get this system out there so that when you're hiring drivers, prospective drivers, you know if in fact they've already tested positive at a different employer or in a different pre-employment test, or if they've refused to test. So all of those elements are pieces that we are determined to put in place, and that proposed rule we expect to be on the street this year, preferably by the fall. So with that, I want to thank you all for your focused attention on what is a very dry briefing, but it's stuff that clearly at FMCSA we're extremely passionate about, and we're passionate about it because of all the good and high standards that so many carriers already practice, and our work is very focused on ensuring that those that don't are taken care of, are addressed, are doing the right thing. So with that, I want to thank you, and we can maybe take a few questions.
Concerning education in driver's schools, we have in the state of Alabama, and most all states, you can go to a driving school for 4 weeks and come out with a CDL, and it's qualified to drive anywhere in the United States. And like from the southeast, they've never driven in snow, never driven in big towns. Why hadn't the issue been addressed of a complete driving school instead of just something to introduce them just enough to get killed or cause a wreck? And that's probably more dangerous than some of the things that's going on in the industry.
Yeah, it's a great question. We have the question about entry-level driver training or training requirements. You're absolutely right. There are none today. There are experience requirements, but no training requirements. We have a proposed rule that's been on the street for a number of years that's called the entry-level driver training rule. And the challenge with driver training, we're continuing to press forward on this issue. We probably won't be able to finish it and put it out on the street until 2013 as a final rule that would set driver training requirements. The challenge has been documenting that driver training actually results in improved safety. Those of you who may recall, when I was growing up, we had driver training, driver's ed in high school. And it was in many ways, in many cases, funded through federal grants. That was back in the 60s and 70s. Driver's ed was stopped. Funding, I should say, through the federal government was stopped because it was very tough to document the link and the long-term benefits of driver training and the safety of those young drivers. Now, many states have pressed forward on graduated licensing and overcome it. But the same challenge confronts us as we try to press forward with an entry-level driver training rule. It's proving that there is a very clear savings, overall safety savings in the long run when you require training for commercial drivers. It defies common sense because we all know that a trained driver is a better driver, a thoroughly trained driver, not one put through a mill, driving school mill, but one who has really received strong professional training and mentoring from their companies. But that's the challenge we face in pressing forward. When we do a rule, we have an obligation to do a regulatory evaluation and identify the cost to business and to the extent possible to create, to minimize the burden on industry and to create an outcome that's cost beneficial in the net. So again, that's more than you wanted to hear. We're pressing forward with the concept because we frankly agree with you. There's not a person in this room, and there's probably not a person, whether it's enforcement, whether it's safety, whether it's an owner-operator, who doesn't agree that driver training is a very important safety measure for us to take. Yeah.
Question.
So 2013, look for that. Yes?
I have a couple questions for you. When you're talking about thresholds to determine your safety fitness determination, is that going to be based off measures, or you're saying you're going to be going away from the percentile rank? Will you be going off a measure score, and will that include safety event groups, and where are we on that as far as here's the problem that we run into. Let me lay it out like this. So we're kind of on a tipping point between a few different safety event groups. So 1 month we might be at a 40 percentile rank. The following month we might get a couple inspections and they still could be clean and send us into a higher safety event group, and that 40 went to a 70 or an 80, puts us in alert status, and we're jumping back and forth in that manner. So, you know, will there be more safety event groups in the future? Or are you staying at 5? Few questions in there. I don't know if
no, so those are good. They're all good, and they're questions that we keep, that we're very challenged. We challenge ourselves with, because the reality is CSA is the right direction to take. The SMS data is very robust data. We'll use the body of that data and the theory behind it in a safety fitness determination rule, because all of a sudden it does enable us to rate 200,000 carriers instead of just 16,000 a year, and in a fairer and more current way using performance data. But what we do need to minimize is the instability of those that are, as you say, along, you know, sort of along the lines, and that's something we're very cognizant of. And the best I can tell you there is look at the proposal very closely when we roll it out. There's a limit to how much I can talk about a proposed rule that's in development until it's been published. But we are very cognizant of that issue, and that's part of the challenge that we plan to overcome before we release it as a proposal. Yeah, just again, we want to minimize the bouncing along a line that there's some categories and some carriers that just because of their size get into. Yeah.
Question here from the audience. A major issue with hours of service is, pardon me?
Oh,
right
there
here,
you are.
Right here. A major issue with hours of service is receivers and shippers with dwell time and downtime with loading and unloading. What, if anything, can FMCSA do to put pressure on them to, you know, release the drivers earlier?
Yeah, detention time, downtime. Right now, the best we can do is use a bullet pulpit, and I'll keep using it. From the FMCSA has kicked off research on the impact of detention time on driver fatigue and driver focus. We want to continue to dive deep into this issue. There's some level of detention time that's expected or reasonable, but there's a lot of detention time that is uncompensated time, is time that stresses the driver to the point where he or she can't complete their trip or their load within the hours obligated, hasn't them pushing limits, or being completely undercompensated. And so across the board, detention time has a serious impact, in our view, on some drivers' ability to operate safely and companies to operate within compliance standards and safe standards. So to that end, we do not have authority or regulatory authority over shippers. But we do have the opportunity to continue to talk about this issue, raise awareness about it, learn more about it, clarify the links between detention time and driver safety, and to the extent possible, continue to meet with the shipping industry, which we do, and make sure that the shipping industry understands what the SMS data is and what it is not, and that it's one piece of data in the mix of looking at the carriers they're using. But detention time is a real challenge, and a real challenge. So as far as we can go now is really the bully pulpit. And if someone has other ideas where we could be or should be pursuing that question, let us know, because in the meantime we'll be doing it through research.
Excuse me. Is there going to be any, have you looked at any flexibility in the hours of service? I mean, in the 15-hour rule, I mean, that seems to be a big issue in the 15-hour rule, especially if you're having a team operation and that type of thing. Are they holding fast on the 15-hour rule?
What's the 15-hour rule?
Driving on duty?
Well, 11 hours.
Well, 11 hours, yeah. But
yeah. So the current rule, the rule that we have going into effect in July 2013 is the rule that's going into effect. It's 11-hour drive time, it's a 14-hour overall day, 34-hour restart once a week, and that restart's got to include 2 periods of rest between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m. That's the rule as it stands. That's the rule that will take effect in July of 2013. And it's a rule that has an impact on some portion of the carrier population, but not on the vast majority of carriers, interestingly enough. The whole intent of that rule was to reduce the risk of cumulative fatigue that occurs when someone is actually asked, expected to, or does maximize the current schedule that allows them to run up to 80 hours, really, in 7 days. When that's done, under the new rule, that will still be possible, once or twice in a 4 to 5 week cycle, but not week after week after week. And the recovery from cumulative fatigue is virtually impossible when you continue that sort of a cycle and that sort of a pattern. So the underlying principle behind the new rule is to reduce that risk of cumulative fatigue, both in an overall week or an overall longer period of time.
And good morning.
Good morning.
We go back a long ways to the MMTA days when I was safety director at RF Klein and Frederick.
That's right.
And you are the perfect person for this job, I might add.
You're kind to say that even now.
And I have a small concern, something I read in the Federal Register back in September of 11 about registrant-only carriers and the future of PRISM in the safety statistics. And something I'd like to bring to your attention humbly in front of this crowd is that we find the enforcement officers at the point of contact with the individual drivers are not asking for the correct motor carrier information. Therefore, your bare rental houses are being charged with violations that they have no control over with safety whatsoever at all. So my question today is, what does the administration plan to do with registrant-only carriers? Thank you.
Well, I'm going to quote Ari Fleischer. I don't know. No, I do know. I do know. We've got the registrant-only number actually created more complications than benefits. The goal of the registrant-only was to simplify the PRISM system. And for those who aren't familiar with PRISM, PRISM takes actions that we have taken against a carrier where we've issued an out-of-service order for a carrier, suspended them for one reason or another, and incorporates it into the state's database and the state's decisions to renew registration, deny license plates to the first time renew, or actually go out and pick up tags. There are a number of states that are in PRISM now. The registrant-only number was a tool to facilitate that process because many states don't collect a DOT number. We are shifting away from the registrant-only number. We're going to do away with it. Your question in terms of the leasing and rental industry is one that we've continued to address and meet with large leasing companies to minimize the kind of outcome that you've just described. It is an education issue for law enforcement, but I want to also kind of take your question back to our team and see if there's some other areas. Are you still seeing leasing companies cited for violations that are not being operated under their own authority? Yeah, let us follow up. Let us follow up.
Administrator, back to the topic of detention time and shippers and receivers. I read an article in an industry publication, not ours, last week that speculated that the administration might be looking at actually regulatory ability over shippers and receivers, specifically on the issue of detention time. I'm not going to ask you to speculate on whether or not that's something you're looking to do, but I'd be interested to know, is there a regulatory process in place that would allow the administration to actually achieve that ability?
There is not. There is no authority for us today to extend any of our oversight to shippers. What we proposed recently and what we really put forward as our 5-year strategic plan is the concept that we need to see safety in the full supply chain, and that shippers and folks further up the supply chain have a dramatic impact on the ability for that driver, that company, to run that last mile as safely as possible. Detention time, contracts, other actions they may take at the shipping or receiving facility. So conceptually, we see safety as something that needs to be built into the supply chain, that every entity involved in that process needs to be held accountable for their own actions that impact that, or inactions, that it's a challenge if it's always the law enforcement officer at the roadside and the trucking company pushing back up against a system that's putting pressure to operate unsafely routinely. We've got to figure out a way to push back against that system. We do not have any standing authority to reach out to shippers, but we've certainly put a foot in the direction of saying what shippers do matters to safety. And they need to know that, and they need to be held accountable for that. For now, through visibility into their own actions is really probably the best route. Now, our Motor Carrier Safety Advisory Committee, which is an advisory committee established under the last reauthorization bill that has representation from industry, from for-hire, from private, shipping, safety advocacy, law enforcement, insurance, and and our own folks as staff. That advisory committee has looked at a system that Australia uses called chain of control. It's actually a system, actually it's a law in Australia, and different states within Australia have put that in place, where the Australia Transport Commission or their local state counterparts will pursue action against shippers that exercise practices that result in unsafe operations overall. That's not something that we have on our books. It's, again, and we aren't actively pursuing it. What we're actively pursuing today is the recognition that shippers have a role in the ultimate safety of the delivery of that product.
I want to go back to a question that was asked earlier, because I'm still not totally clear. It was something you mentioned in your comments. Did I understand it correctly that FMCSA's intent under the new safety fitness determination rule would be to judge individual carriers against a fixed set of standards as opposed to the peer ranking approach that you're using now? Is that?
Conceptually. You're going to have to quote yourself on that statement, not me. Because again, because we're in a rulemaking cycle, I'm very limited into what I can describe. But again, what you likely would not see is a proposed safety rating based on the relative averaging that we do under SMS. I think that's the best way to say it.
Okay. And one quick follow-up, or not follow-up, but a different question. On the crash rating issue, understanding all of the difficulties there are in actually determining whether something is preventable or not, or should be recorded at fault, would it be FMCSA's intent that as long as you are not making a determination on every crash, that the crash indicator would remain hidden from public view?
Absolutely.
As a matter of fairness? Okay.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. I do want to reassure everybody, we have no intention of publishing the crash indicator until we've completely addressed this question and addressed it in a manner that we're all satisfied makes sense to put that public. That crash indicator will stay as a behind-the-screen indicator for us in our prioritization work and for yourselves. Yeah, thank you for asking that.
Question from the audience over here. What safety effect is there in only one 34-hour restart per week?
What safety impact? Again, restriction of using the restart only once in a 7-day period is the one that actually had the biggest impact on reducing the overall number of hours a carrier can run. Simply put, under the current rule, if you run, let me do my math real quick. If you run 5 days and you're working 14-hour days, so 5 times 4, we're already up to 70 hours. You'd use your restart. On the 7th day, you run again, 11-hour drive, 14-hour workday. You're already up to 81, 82, 84 hours in a 7-day period. Using that restart once a week, once in a 7-day period, is probably the biggest kind of full stop that reduces the risk of cumulative fatigue. Now, a driver may still run that longer stretch in 1 2-week period, but they won't be able to repeat it. Because again, you've got the restriction on the 34-hour restart to once a week. So there's still room for drivers, because in many cases what we found when we were preparing this rule and doing the research for it, many companies said, we don't maximize hours every week, but we need it from time to time. And that model can still be used from time to time, but just not week after week after week after week, where you can't recover from a double-time job, running 80 hours a week, week after week after week. It's exhausting. You know it. You see it in your own drivers or in your own workforce. And most of you, I suspect, don't even have drivers running those kinds of hours.
You mentioned earlier how moving the cargo-related to a separate hazmat and into vehicle maintenance, and you actually saw an effect in the vehicle maintenance section of cargo-related where 40% more were visible. I'm curious what you've seen in the hazmat part of it and the net effect of that, because it sounds like from what we've experienced in talking to other carriers that one basics got split into 2 different areas and the numbers kind of exploded.
You know, it's interesting. As you recall, the cargo securement basic was kind of kept behind the screen as well, because there was a bias against flatbed carriers, again, because flatbed violations, cargo securement violations on flatbeds are so much easier to detect and identify and so much more numerous than those within a closed van. That bias is what kept us holding that behind the screen until we did additional analysis on the cargo securement basic. When we shifted, again, the whole point for us under CSA is to make sure that we have as sharp a tool as possible to identify the carriers that need our attention. And the data shows, let's say just warning letters. When we send warning letters out, 8 out of 10 carriers change their behavior. That warning letter is sent to carriers that have basics that are trending in the wrong direction. 8 out of 10 carriers actually demonstrated over time an improvement and a reduction in their overall violations as a result of just that simple contact of a letter. So the in-person contact is even more extreme. So we are using CSA to make sure we're talking and contacting the right folks. So we need the tool to be as sharp as possible and making sure it's pointing us towards the higher risk carriers. So in the case of moving the cargo securement, or I should say the load securement violations over to vehicle maintenance basic, moving it out of an area where it looked like it was skewing an overall result, we actually found that our ability to focus on the carriers that were presenting a higher crash risk, a crash risk that was 16 times higher than those, not the 11 times higher that was already in that vehicle maintenance for those above the basic, we found that it actually sharpened our focus on that mix of carriers. Actually, the overall number of carriers went down and the actual risk profile went up by virtue of that performance data. So we saw it actually play out the way it's supposed to in terms of an improvement that continues to sharpen our focus and that appears more balanced to the carrier populations who are impacted by those basics. But you got to look at your own numbers to see if that's the case. The hazmat basic was derived from the community of hazardous material carriers, hazardous material specialists in the enforcement community, and some in the hazardous materials manufacturing industry, where they said we need to be sure we've got a basic that's just looking at hazmat violations, because law enforcement will say it just anecdotally and other carriers will say it anecdotally. There are some in the community, whether it's shippers or carriers, who are not abiding by the standards of placarding, who are not abiding by the standards either in error or on purpose, because they may not know, maybe it is an error, are not abiding by the standards of notification, of proper identification of the content in the van or in the tank. And those are the kinds of areas that needed to be highlighted. Now, when you say it blew up, it was somewhat startling because we saw carriers with some very good basics all of a sudden very high way above a threshold on the hazardous materials basic. That, again, what is that indicating? Is it indicating that carriers that don't carry hazmat regularly have a much higher non-compliance rate than carriers that do it as a routine piece of their business? That's what the data overall says to us. It is still in the preview stage. We have not revealed that publicly. It is getting people's attention. The hazmat basic numbers and violations can be brought down by carriers who are looking at those numbers closely, by making sure their shippers are giving them the proper documentation and they're showing it as well. And the challenge is for everybody who is impacted by it to get your comments into us so that we know what the impact is, what you see could be or should not be done or should be done with that particular basic before we go public with it. And that's the very reason why we're extending the preview period on these changes, because there are areas of questions that we haven't gotten that much feedback on, and we're trying to make it very easy to provide feedback. If you go to your own page, there's a link to take you right into the area where you can put comments in. So we really encourage you to do that. Now, back to what does a hazmat basic show? It again is an indicator in terms of the violation history of those carriers that are high in the basic, that those carriers are likely to continue to have violations in hazmat placarding, in hazmat paperwork keeping, just in their lack of knowledge or lack of application of the standards on hazmat safety. That's what that one indicates. It's not a correlation to crash risk, it's a correlation to future non-compliant behavior when it comes to hazardous materials. And that's what gets at ensuring that we're reducing the severity of an outcome. Because if it's not placarded right, and the emergency first responders show up and they don't know what to do with the particular thing that's emanating from that truck, there could be a real problem. And that's what the notification and the placarding pieces are all about. It's a kind of a long-standing principle in the world of hazardous materials enforcement. I want to say 20, 30 years back.
Very good. I think we have time for one more question, if anybody has one. Okay, if not, I'd like to thank Administrator
Great,
Ferro
great.
very much for what you do.
Yeah, you're welcome.